Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and today we will be doing an educational follow up to Clara's story. And Clara's story is an interesting story because even though you see how angry her partner is all the time, the abuser, Clara also sees how this person grew up. She was able to experience this person's family, and it can be very easy to keep telling yourself that what you're dealing with, it could be emotional immaturity, it could be that they're damaged, that maybe, they're coming from this difficult family. Maybe they just don't know how to communicate. That is something that Clara said during our episode. And maybe finally they will get the help that they need and things will get better. And that's part of what makes this kind of abuse in this story really hard to see clearly. And sometimes the full picture doesn't show up at the beginning. Sometimes you see pieces, there's friction that could be going on. You see some of the effects, but you really don't fully understand this person until you stop cooperating with the system that is protecting them. And that is a huge part of Clara's story. So today I want to talk about the core themes in Clara's story: the fear, obligation, and guilt and shame that kept everything in place for so long. But before we get to that, if you want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes like Clara was this week, go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, click on the guest form button at the top of the page. There, you fill out our guest form and press the submit button. We also have a newsletter at our website, a new newsletter. And with our newsletter, you get reflections of what happened in Clara's episode, reflections on your life, plus you get a free workbook as well. And you can sign up for that at narcissistapocalypse.com. And we also have a support group at narcissistapocalypse.com with great people inside. And they have Zoom meetings every Wednesday night, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights. And we have forum boards for you to post on to get validation as well. So sign up at our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. And for those of you who didn't hear Clara's story, I'm going to go into a really quick overview of what happened. Clara grew up in a home where her father's anger and silent treatment controlled the emotional atmosphere of what was going on. And when she named what was happening, when she pointed out the tension that was going on, when she reacted to what was going on right in front of her, she was labeled the problem. She became the problem. And over time, she learned the lesson that if something is wrong, it will still somehow be your job to fix it, to explain it, absorb it. And then later on in life, Clara meets someone who at first seems supportive and wanting a future with her. This relationship moved very quickly. Their lives and finances became very intertwined early. But over time, Clara found herself dealing with this person's chronic anger, gaslighting, a domineering mother-in-law, financial dependence, and isolation. And then eventually the children started to get the anger put on to them. There was a lot of emotional fallout when it came to the children. And as this happened, eventually Clara got to the point where she started to think about divorce. And once she started naming that divorce out loud, that is when she saw what her abuser really was like. Once she put her foot down at the end here, and then this person started to manipulate this divorce and started to want to be amicable about everything, maybe try and fix things, and hoovered her back. And when he hoovered her back, this person was doing things in the background, unbeknownst to her. And money was then being filtered out of accounts. He was buying a house with that money on his own without permission. And then it became a battle in this divorce, and this divorce was still ongoing. And she didn't know that this person would go this far until she said no, and the finality of it was there. And then she got to see what this abuser truly was and capable of doing. So a big key theme of this story is that anger can hide inside a lot of excuses. And one of the reasons this story works the way it does is because the anger was easy to explain away, and people can tell themselves all kinds of things. My partner is stressed. My partner is overwhelmed. My partner had a difficult mother. My partner had a difficult father. My partner just doesn't know how to communicate. They just react badly. He's not scary. He's just angry. He's not cruel. He's just damaged. There's these excuses that can go on for this anger because you can see what this person's life was like. And Clara did what a lot of people do in these situations. She keeps trying to place his anger inside a story that would make things manageable. And she kept trying to understand it. She kept trying to solve it. She kept thinking that there was a better version of him somewhere underneath all of this. And maybe the right kind of therapy can unlock it. Because if anger is only anger in your mind, anger can be treated and maybe anger can be improved. And within this story, anger became the atmosphere of everything, and it becomes pressure. And it's a way where everyone in this story, in Clara's story, was organizing themselves around this angry person. And another key theme of this story is the family systems, and it creates a recreation. And this recreation of this family system is somewhat familiar to Clara. And in that sense, everything then becomes very hard to see because the husband here, the abuser here, is an angry person and he is an abuser. But this person's mother, Clara's mother-in-law, is also part of this story. So it's a full kind of family story in a way. And this mother is domineering. She's taking covert digs at Clara, undermining Clara, making comments. There's a tone that is going on. There's the subtext of what's being said that is going on. And this kind of environment can become really exhausting and hard to prove, especially if your partner is not looking out for you and not defending you. And for Clara in this situation, this is a big recreation of the family system that she grew up in, because she grew up in a home where reality was distorted, where the problem began to be her response to the atmosphere that she was in. So later when she enters into this marriage, she's again around this unhealthy emotional system, this unhealthy family system, a system built on silence and denial, and her being cast as the difficult one. And it recreated something that she already knew, that she was already a part of. And what makes it difficult for her being in this situation, everything here is familiar. And when there's familiarity, it's easier to live within that space because you've been used to it for your whole entire life. And another key theme here is the financial abuse. And the financial abuse in this situation is that it was occurring with her not actually seeing it. It was pretty quiet at the beginning. And a lot of people think of financial abuse as someone just saying, no, you can't have money, or denying them money. But sometimes financial abuse can start out with just the entangling of finances, which happened very early on in this relationship, where things got entangled pretty quickly. Everything was moving very quick. And then letting one person take over the financial system, and then also one person feeling like they have no independence anymore. And for Clara here, she was giving up her PhD. She was giving up everything. Her career is getting interrupted. A move from the town that they were in to an even smaller town occurs. And then she's economically dependent on her partner. And then information about accounts stops being transparent. And with Clara, there was retirement planning gets dismissed. Spending eventually starts to get scrutinized, and her ordinary needs begin to feel like burdens. So this was a slow ramp up in this instance, in this story. And for a lot of people, it is a slow ramp up like this. And by the time Clara really starts to act in her own self-interest, the financial imbalance has kind of already occurred, and her mobility has been hampered. Getting a job is more difficult because she's been out of the workforce for so long. And that takes a hit on your confidence, and that makes leaving even more difficult. And then when the separation occurs before the divorce actually takes place, that's when you see the extent of what this person will do when it comes to financial control, putting her into an even deeper hole and holding the house hostage so she can't get extra funds to go through a proper divorce. And they still are in a trial right now, and a lack of resources is a big part of it. And then the last big theme we're going to talk about is how anger affects the children. And for Clara and her children, being around a parent that is angry all the time, it really starts to affect the children and have an impact on them, even though the person might not be explosive. It's just the mood, the chronic atmosphere of that anger is affecting them. And children begin to scan, they begin to anticipate, they begin to make themselves feel smaller or be smaller, and they begin to organize around setting someone off, even though that person might not be set off. There's the fear of that. And then when the children do speak up about the anger in this situation and they tell the safe parent what happened, the abusive parent in this story later then makes the children feel guilty for telling on them. And that brings a layer of guilt to these children that they betrayed their dad. They then might feel shame about themselves as well, creating an even further unsafe environment for these kids. So the child is not only afraid of the anger, they're now carrying the responsibility. They're just afraid to share anything at that point, because the lesson here for this child becomes, if I tell the truth, I hurt people, or if I speak up, someone becomes sad. And if I name what happened, then I'm the one that caused that problem. And that's a terrible thing to put on a child, a terrible emotional burden to put on a child. And this is a really big key theme that goes on in this story, and I'm sure goes on with other people's stories as well. And now we're going to discuss the fear, obligation, guilt, and shame in Clara's story. So the fear in Clara's story is more of an atmospheric fear. Fear of what mood is waiting in the next room, and fear of this constant anger. And Clara describes her abuser as just constantly being angry, That is his mood throughout the household all the time. And it doesn't stop with just her. It's with the children as well. And that means everyone has to organize themselves around this mood. Even if this person is not raging, it's just this mood becomes the emotional climate of the house. So it's not technically, let's say, a terror that some people have. It's still a kind of a fear, though, that makes you want to keep the peace, to not set this person off, even though they might never get set off. You don't want to make things worse. Maybe now is not the right time to bring something up because of that anger that is happening. Or maybe I should wait. Maybe I should be more careful. This kind of fear here is a way to maintain control. And in this story, it helps kick the can down the road. Things aren't going to get addressed. Even though sometimes Clara does address things, eventually they still start getting kicked down the road further and further and further, and nothing is happening. So there might be a tiny no, but that no never holds, and it just goes, and the abuser knows this. And then there's obligation in this story. And Clara was trained very early on to feel responsible for other people's moods and behaviors growing up. And in this story, Clara feels responsible for being fair, responsible for being understanding. She feels responsible for supporting his career, responsible for keeping things workable, even, she's the one who is being mistreated. So this responsibility to this person, to being fair to this abuser, to being understanding of where this abuser came from, and supporting this person in every way, this responsibility, this obligation keeps her in this relationship longer. And combine that with the fear, she feels obligated to do these things to keep this family going. And in an abusive relationship, this really becomes like a leash, and this control just keeps on going. And up next, we have guilt. And In this story, Clara feels guilty for reacting to his anger, even though his anger is what is shaping the home. She feels guilty for bringing things up, guilty for not letting things go, guilty for being the one who names what is wrong. So the abuser in Clara's life, her husband, is creating the problem, and Clara is responding to the problem and starts to wonder if she is the problem. And in this case, she sees him as someone who is shaped by his domineering mother, someone who's damaged by his upbringing, someone who needs help. And once you start holding a story like that together, guilt can keep you attached to this person for a very long time. And it's hard to see clearly when guilt is running you or when obligation was running you, because now, leaving does not just feel like leaving an abusive person. It can start to feel like you're abandoning someone. And, this is what happened in Clara's story. The guilt and the obligation were working together here. She's obligated and feels responsible to him. And at the same time, she feels guilty. She's understanding where he came from. And then we have shame. And this is where she turns everything back on to herself. So in this relationship, when Clara becomes the one who is upset, or she's trying to prove reality, she's trying to get him to admit what had happened, Clara here, the survivor, often ends up more distressed than the person who is causing the distress. And that starts to create a shame within Clara, because she's not just now only dealing with the abuse, she's now dealing with the fact that she is the one that is looking like she is unstable. She starts to think that she is the problem, and that can be something that keeps someone stuck trying to fix this dynamic instead of leaving it. And she was coming into this relationship from her family having these types of beliefs as well, that maybe she is too much or too reactive. And this is kind of proving that kernel of truth correct. So the shame here starts to push her into self-correcting and over-understanding. And that can really delay clarity for a very long time. And that shame is used as a form of control. And they're all feeding into each other. And the biggest turning point for Clara in her story is when it starts to really affect her children, because it's one thing when it's happening to you, but when it starts to affect her children and she really sees what is happening to her children, she starts to think about divorce. And when she brings up divorce and really wants to stick with that divorce, that is when she starts to get clarity, because this person who was, getting away with the can being kicked down the road, all of a sudden the can isn't getting kicked down the road anymore. And now what was really underneath when someone says no for a final time, this person starts to really show up and starts to really manipulate the finances, tries to manipulate court, tries to manipulate a lot of different things. And I think just the biggest takeaway from this story is that there's one thing to understand where someone came from and give that person empathy for who they are and what they've been through, but it still doesn't give them an excuse to, create an unsafe environment all of the time. And for Clara, she was used to that environment. And it was a little slightly easier for her to be able to sit in it a little longer and to think that it wasn't completely abnormal. But, when you're giving someone empathy for whatever they're dealing with, it still doesn't give that person an excuse to be abusive or to have their mood constantly take over a whole entire household and inflict that mood onto other people. And then it takes just a really long time once you're living in it to get clarity. And a lot of that clarity can happen for people only when you say no and stick to that. And then you can eventually see who the person you are with really is, which is why in some episodes I don't know how many years ago, there was a period where I was always saying, like, I think you should just say early on in the relationship, like, no to something a bunch of different times just to see how someone will react. And if they do not act well, then, that's a big sign. But it's a pretty good test to have. So this has been the debrief, as I always use on my titles, or the follow-up to Clara's survivor story. And if this felt familiar to you, I'm giving you a big hug out there. And, a lot of people don't really fully understand what they're dealing with until they stop cooperating with what is going on with the other person's version of reality. And when that happens, you really get to see what the other person is like. And these things can go downhill pretty quickly. And I hope this follow-up episode was educational and helpful for people, gave a little bit more depth to Clara's story and to maybe your story as well. And if you want to be a guest like Clara was on our survivor stories, go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, click on the guest form button, fill out the guest form, and press the submit button. And that is it for today's episode. And I hope you have a good night.